Okay, so I think we should start now. Hi, everyone. My name is Florence, and I am pleased to invite you to this Inspire Leadership Conversion for Nurses and Midwives. We are delighted to have Dr. Rose Clark Nanyonga have a conversation with us about nursing leadership in Uganda. She is a champion for this cause. She has done a lot of advocacy as as most of us were worried about COVID-19 and what's going to happen to us as individuals. Dr. Rose was spearheading teams to manage and to represent nurses and midwives in the fight against COVID, and looking at what the role of nurses is and their contribution, and a lot has been done towards that. And so I'm really, really honored to be introducing Dr. Rose to have with us a conversation about how she's inspiring leaders, nursing leaders, and how she's moving forward that agenda in Uganda for not just nurses and midwives, but for the improvement of the healthcare system in Uganda. You're welcome, Dr. Rose.
Thank you so much, Florence, for having me here again. I'm delighted to co-host these conversations with you. And as people would like to know, these conversations are supported by the Health Professionals Initiative, HEPI, of which Clark International University is a part. I'm going to share, that's not what I want to share. Give me 1 second so I can share the right screen.
And maybe just a quick one as Dr. Rose is sharing. When you join, could you kindly let us know where you're coming from, the institution that you represent for recording purposes. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Rose.
Thank you very much, Florence. So today, I want to talk a little bit about a topic that is close to my heart and for which I'm really passionate, which is creating opportunities for young nurse and midwife leaders in Uganda. And during this talk, I will explain why it is important for us to begin to look at that group of pool of nurses, because the older and senior leadership pool is diminishing, not just in Uganda, but globally. I want to start with Nicholas, can you mute yourself? Thank you very much. I want to start with this slide, which I use for majority of my leadership talks, that for young and aspiring leaders, we need to be able to think the unthinkable. We need to inspire leadership, not just for ourselves, but for others. We need to tap into ingenuity, creativity, and innovation which exists, that talent pool that is usually not represented, and ignite transformation in the work that we do, and therefore make a difference. Today's conversation is going to focus on these following items. We are going to look at leaders as tenants of time and context. We will look at the current stock of leadership in terms of numbers. We will look at leadership through the lens of the various generations, the young versus the old. We will try to understand the context of leadership and how that context demands a certain type of leadership, and why then it's crucial for us to enable leadership by tapping into the pool of young nurses and midwives to expand the stock of current leadership and we will end the conversation with a Q&A, and hopefully we will be able to wrap this up within an hour and a half. So current leaders are tenants of time and context. And this is really important because the tenancy agreement is such that as leaders, and I'm counting myself in that group, we must respond to the perceived needs of today. And we need to be able to develop leaders that can manage the changes that will be required of future healthcare systems. And this is really important because I think if we do not take care of that tenancy agreement, there is the issue of inheritance, that the people coming behind us are going to inherit either a failed approach, or they will be able to inherit something that we have worked really hard to improve on. In terms of taking stock, we need to understand who today's nurse and midwife leaders are, and also the perceptions of current leadership through the lens of the young and nurse and midwife leader, because there are generational gaps, and it's important to understand that generation divide. And also the context as the stage for where leadership occur within our time as well as the future. So in terms of the stock, there are some sobering demographics in a recent survey that we were looking at, where 83% of nurses and midwives are under the age of 45. So they sit between 23 to 45 years of age. That is the largest pool of nurses and midwives, and it is also the largest pool for where we need to be developing leaders because of the following numbers. Only 13% of nurses and midwives were under the age of 55, but above the age of 45. And only 3.4% were above the age of 55. Now, that's a really interesting number, because the majority of leadership positions in Uganda and outside of Uganda are occupied by persons 55 years of age and above. That is only 3.4%. This limits the pool of leadership. The deficits are inadequate to meet the current needs and the demands. And also, studies are indicating that there is very little intentional succession planning, that we are not rapidly creating opportunities for other leaders to step into that role. According to Duval and Andrews, this was in 2012, they predicted that nearly 40 to 60% of nurses and midwives over the age of 40 would have retired by 2021. So that's really worrying, especially if majority of our leaders are above 55 years of age. In the context of COVID-19, these numbers are likely to dwindle. The reported losses in Uganda are largely among nurse and midwife leaders of this age group. And I didn't want to show that slide here of all the persons that we have lost in 2020 and also just in January opening of this year. So there are concerns, and it means that we need young nurse and midwife leaders. We need to be able to tap into the pool of that age group, 23 to 45 years of age. However, we have a growing divide between young leaders in how young leaders perceive the senior leaders, and also how senior leaders perceive young leaders. For example, young leaders perceive senior leaders or the current leadership in general as broken and not well coordinated. There is misdirection of allocation and application of resources. There are significant gaps between the promise and the performance. There is abuse of authority and privileges of those in leadership. They perceive leadership as having a weak culture of accountability in particular. There is a tendency to focus on politics rather than governance. Selection of promotions is often driven by patronage rather than talent and performance. There is a lack of stakeholder empowerment, and that the senior leadership is simply stuck and not open to change. Whereas through the lens of senior leaders, they perceive young leaders to be presumptuous, pompous, proud, unpredictable, and there is a tendency for disregard of traditions, including, for example, nurse and midwifery attires. So this generational difference is important for us to understand if we are going to create opportunity for bringing those two groups together. We need to understand each other, and we need to understand where we are coming from and how history shapes who we are as current leaders, but also how history is likely to shape the leadership of the next generation. And that's why I said that leaders are tenants of context and time. So when we look at this, these are global generation differences. This image we are familiar with, we see it quite often. We have the veterans of 1943, the baby boomers of the 1960s, the Gen X's of the 1980s, the millennials, 1995, and Gen Z to present 1996. And this is really not just an image, but it is important to know that these people behave differently. They behave differently in the workplace. So in terms of work ethic, loyalty, in terms of their ability to learn technology and use technology and integrate technology into what they do every day, and also in terms of the reporting relationships. And here is a quick guide. It does look busy for a webinar, but it's important for us to think about it when we start thinking about developing young leaders. So for the senior leaders, you know, who fall into this veteran group and the boomers group, you know, they are very committed, work long hours, okay? They are loyal to the employer with some limitations. They are fascinated with technology, or sometimes technologically challenged. There is a strong chain of command. Whereas when you get to the millennials and the Gen Zs, you know, lifestyle comes first, okay? Those are our young people. That's the pool of young leaders for nurses and midwives. Loyalty, as it assists with their career, okay? They will be loyal to you if there is something for them to get. They are technology immersed. So there's an opportunity there to explore how then we can enhance the competencies of technology among nurses and midwives of this age group, so that they can then use that to enhance healthcare outcomes for patients and families. They are respectful, but they will move ahead, okay? So when we start demanding that they respect and they respect and they respect, you know, we have to be able to give them a reason for doing that. Generation differences also inform leadership cultures and traditions. They inform the way, for example, we approach our work. They inform the way we adapt to change or not. They are also a tool, for the future. So there is an urgent need to recognize the potential for intergenerational friction while simultaneously seeing the opportunity for leadership development that will harness the positive and untapped potential of young nurse and midwife leaders. We should not look at those differences as a negative thing. It's an opportunity for us to explore how the two groups can actually work for us to get on with the business of succession planning. The other item I wanted to talk about or highlight so that we can get into Q&A is the context. There are contextual challenges and inheritance concerns, of course. What are the young leaders inheriting? Why should they even be interested in becoming leaders in the current context? And that's a question for any senior leader who is in the webinar this afternoon. We also need to think about context in terms of its ability to either enable or disable leadership for current and future leaders in Uganda. But also we need to think about context in terms of opportunities. What are the available opportunities? What opportunities are we creating to open doors for other young blood to get into the pipeline for leadership? We also know that the context of healthcare in general is fast-paced and is really complex. There are a plethora of technologies that are creating disruptions as well as opportunities. They are changing comorbidities. But one of the issues that keeps coming to the table again and again, and this is true for Uganda, for Sub-Saharan Africa, and other healthcare systems across the world, is the scarcity of resources where nearly all hospitals are in deficits. So this is the context for leadership for nurses. So the context creates new demands on those in leadership, so the current tenants, but also warrants asking some important questions. For example, what kind of leadership does the context demand, okay? And what can we envision for the future in terms of balancing focus on the short-term wins as well as the long-term vision for developing new leaders? These demands within the context underscore the need to unlock the potential of nursing leadership and increase not just the quality, but also the number of leaders that we have in the country. We needed to strengthen the decisive nursing and midwifery voice, and we can only do that if we have the numbers. So without the numbers, with those percentages looking smaller and minuscule, we really have no opportunity to strengthen the lobbying and the decisive voice of nurses and nursing and midwives in leadership. But also we really need to increase the span of control for the nursing and midwifery professions. And again, we can only do that if we have the numbers. So more voices at the policy table. We keep talking about that. And of course, there are 4 areas of change in the electronic world that impact on how we can tool people for leadership. How information is documented, shared, and transmitted, the media mastering those skills for young leaders, not just for chatting and having a good time, but how do we use that machine to be able to inform improvement and the positioning or repositioning of nursing and midwifery in the country. Time, open access day and night, and open borders, that we are able to tap into resources that previously we didn't have. So that's part of the context. And those are all opportunities that we need to look at and use those to our advantage when we think about creating opportunities for young leaders, because young leaders, as the studies are indicating, are really tech savvy. So let's tap into that and use that to the advantage of the nursing and midwifery professions. And then, of course, the structure is free-flowing and open. Crucially, understanding the context and the time, we start to ask additional questions. For example, as I mentioned, understanding what kind of leadership the context demands is important in answering the next step of questions. What kind of competencies, what kind of tooling, and what kind of talent does the current and future context require? If we can envision the future context, so then what kind of talent do we need to be developing, so that they are ready, they are context ready, they are future ready. And that brings me to my next slide, or sets of slides, And I love this slide because for me, I'm visual, and I like to picture nurses as this artist put them in this image. What does the future nurse leader actually look like? This is a visual of the current and future nurses and the competing priorities. And you can see this nurse or nurse leader, so to say, is split into almost 6 parts, where they have to have a good understanding of the organizational structures and organizational culture, and so on. And then we have the dollars and the pounds and the shillings, that they need to have competencies to understand the business of healthcare. They also need to understand the politics of healthcare, while at the same time, looking after an aging population. This is true for many other countries, but for us, not necessarily, because 70% of our population are under the age of 35. So we needed to actually know how to look after that population. So these competing priorities, beg the question that I asked previously. So then how do we prepare that kind of leader? How do we prepare them? And the next set of slides, we are going to talk about that, enabling leadership and creating those opportunities for young nurses. So for the current talent, for us to have the capacity to do that, we need to change the tools. So retooling literally means to change the tool, to change the machinery, to change the design, to change the method, to make new models or products. And I really like this definition, because it literally means that senior leaders, if you are in the room, we need to examine our own talent. Because if we are the tenants of context and the time, we need to think about the inheritance. We need to think about what is it that we are modeling that the young nurses and young midwives who aspire to become leaders are going to inherit. Is it even attractive to them? Or are they going to run off to somewhere to get it somewhere else? So, the first step for us really is this notion of retooling, to change the tool, to change the machinery, to change our mindset, the way we have always thought, whether it's about protecting our turf, whether it's keeping those doors closed so that nobody else comes in. We need to rethink that strategy, because that is the only way we are going to be able to allow others in. And we are desperate. We are desperate for those numbers, because the deficit is predicted to get worse. The deficit for leadership is predicted to get worse. And then the second component is demonstrating responsible leadership, which seeks to build capacity to do more in the future and to get things done through greater creativity and building synergy. So I want to start with some of the missed opportunities. We often think about enabling and mentoring in terms of budgets, resources, time, and permissions, rather than in terms of what is the existing talent and the willingness of the existing talent to create room and opportunity for leadership production, for leadership learning, and for leadership maintenance. And I think this slide is really important in terms of the call to action. Yes, the budgets are important and the resources are important, but when we limit our capacity to tool young leaders to budgets, resources, and permissions, it means that we are not looking at alternative strategies of how we can get this done. Because the envelope for the resources is not getting larger. In fact, it's a dwindling resource. Okay, so we need to be able to look beyond while we pursue and lobby for budgets and resources and time and permissions to be able to mentor young leaders. We need to look at alternative strategies, and really it starts with us. What kind of talent and willingness do we actually have for that talent creation, for the production and the learning of leadership among those persons who are currently following us? Next, what can we do without the investment? So parallel strategies for getting young people on the track. Developing intentional consciousness about leadership succession and mentoring. Usually I ask questions when I interact with nurse leaders, and I often ask them, so, what is your succession plan? You are a wonderful senior nursing officer, you are a wonderful SPNO, you are a wonderful chief of staff, you are a wonderful head of department. What is the succession plan for the people who are in that department, who often are much, much younger, less than 45, and you are clearly 60 or nearing 65. So what is the succession plan? Really important. So we need to be creating leadership pipeline and being conscious and intentional about it, and also modeling the type of leadership the context demands. So we just looked at what is happening in the context, how chaotic the context is, and so on. And I didn't even talk about COVID, but all of that is part of the challenging context where nursing and midwifery occurs, and subsequently where leadership occurs. And you know what, I want you to remember one thing, that one cannot have a track record without actually being on the track. I know that sounds so cliche, but if we want young nurse and midwifery leaders to have some kind of resume, to have a track record, they have to have an opportunity to get on that track. Otherwise, there's really no track record to speak of. We also need to increase young nurse and midwife leaders' voice in decision-making. They're active contributors to key discussions and decision-making, influencing scholarship, influencing science, influencing practice. So how do we do this? And usually I say to people, when you come to the table, bring others with you. Historically, we've always talked about nurses bring their own chairs to the table, because nobody has created space or has even created a chair for you, and yet you need to be at that table. But now I think we need to transition from that language of, bringing our own chairs to the table, because some of us are already at the table. And really the next step is to bring others to that table. So every single time you are sitting in a meeting somewhere, decision-making meeting, and you look around you, ask yourself, have you brought others into that conversation? A proactive positioning of nurses at organizational and health policy tables is really important. But the next thing we need to do to create opportunities is a rigorous examination of the current leadership culture, norms, and behaviors. For example, door policies that let others in rather than keeping them out. Is this what is happening in your organization? Because that's one way for us to create opportunities for young nurse and midwifery leaders. You know, this underscores the need to evaluate obstructionist norms and structures that we have adopted and maintained over time, and making sure that there is actually room in the lifeboat for other people. And this really is a call to action for the existing tenants of leadership, the current stock of leaders that we have, okay? Door policies that let other people in, and being intentional about this. I've practiced this over time. You know, it is in terms of time demands, in terms of managing the schedules, it's a rather difficult a culture to sustain. And yet, you know, young nurse and midwife leaders need to have access to leaders. That means we have to have an open door policy. We have to allow them to access us. People can only model what they see. We are always a product of our own experiences, a product of our own culture, a product of our own context. So if we want to enrich the inheritance of leadership for young nurses and midwives, we need to be accessible, and they need to be able to see us in action so that they can learn how to model the same behaviors, or basically learn, you know, what not to do in their own careers. I'm not saying that the current crop of leaders are all perfect. It's not going to be perfect, but access to us is really important. As I mentioned, most leaders model what they have seen or have experienced. They are a product of these internalized and learned experiences. And future nurse and midwife leaders are going to exactly be the same. They are a product of those experiences and internalized norms, which is why it's important for us to examine those norms. Do they fit the kind of leader that we would like to see in the future? So taking stock of current leadership talent should not only be a by the way, it's actually central to the rapid production of new leaders. And we have to be unrelenting and pay attention to what the inputs are. As I mentioned, this nurse torn in 6 parts, you know, what are the inputs? You know, if they have to have a whole framework for financial competencies, you know, how are we making sure that is happening, that they have an astute understanding and acumen for the business of healthcare delivery in our own context? What are the drivers, and so on and so forth? But that they are also understanding the political landscape of where they are going to lobby and how they are going to harness voice to get to the table, but also how they are going to be able to negotiate for what they need. Critically important. Understanding the organization beyond the bedside competencies. So this is really looking at an expanded scope of practice for the nurse, that yes, you know, patient care is not forgotten. It is the core of what we do. However, the context where we are operating now demands that for us to be able to lobby for our patients, to understand the needs of our patients, to improve patient outcomes, we need to understand the political structures, we need to understand the business of healthcare, we need to understand how insurances work, and so on and so forth. We need to understand the trajectory of population demographics and be able to project, you know, what are going to be the needs and therefore what are going to be the competences to meet those needs in the future. And really that brings me to the end of the slide. I wanted this to be more of a conversation with the participants today. I didn't want to overwhelm you so much with the academic you know, platform, which is, you know, I'm an educator, so I live in slides and PowerPoints and so on. But I'm aware that, you know, this conversation is not about, you know, PowerPoints. It's really about generating dialogue and stimulating conversation about these crucial issues of how we can create opportunities for young nurses and midwives. So Florence, I hand it back to you. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to hear other opinions, whether supporting opinions or differing opinions. Thank you very much. And I thank all our viewers on Facebook Live, as well as those who are in the webinar today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose. There was indeed a lot to learn from that, and question triggering concepts there that you've discussed with us. Now, I get to have the privilege to ask the first question. So you've talked about the divide between the young and old nurses, and gets me wondering, are there strategies or evidence? You've talked about some strategies, but are there things that people are actually doing now, or evidence-based practices that are happening elsewhere that we can adopt? Because it's been happening for a while, and I have no doubt people have tried to narrow that gap. But is there anything that's happening or that can happen that could give us a shift that would be significant?
Absolutely. I think that majority of research has actually focused on understanding the differences, but not necessarily on how then those two groups can come together. And I feel that we do have enough data to inform some interventions of how those two groups can come together. But I think the other issue really is finding champions for that conversation to occur. Most of the time when senior leaders, you know, begin to talk about the young nurse leaders, is there a way for us to change that narrative? And I think that's, for me, that's my job, you know, that's where I am a champion. And I think we need more champions who are able to challenge both sides of that dialogue and that narrative to say, you know what, we are not going to change the baby boomers mentality. But at the same time, we are definitely not going to change the millennials mentality. So can we look at what the advantages and what the strengths are of both those groups and use those and leverage those, you know, for what we needed to do as a profession? And I think that's where we need a little bit more data to inform how those narratives and those relationships can be formed meaningfully. In Uganda, in our context, you know, you see that divide happening, and really almost there's nothing in the middle to be able to bridge that divide. And the divide is not simply the cross-generational divide, but it's also the leader versus non-leaders. Because, you know, we have just a lot of young nurses and midwives who have lost faith in the leadership establishment. They lose faith in the current crop of leaders, and which speaks to what I told you about that tenancy agreement, that we are the current tenants, but we are not trusted. And yet that's the core of the inheritance. They are going to have to inherit those leadership positions. So it's crucially important for us to just have an open conversation about those differences and then leverage the talent that exists within both groups for better healthcare outcomes.
Thank you so much. Let me check if we have any questions, any hands up. Please feel free to ask questions, raise your hand in case you need to ask a question. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Okay, at the moment, I have nothing in the chat.
There is a request for subsequent meetings.
Yes.
And thinking about alternative days, because the Friday probably doesn't work. We can probably consider other days, but I think that, you know, any time we choose is probably not going to fit, you know, everybody. But this is a continuing conversation. We had this series all of last year. And this is our first one this year. We are likely to have probably one every month. So a total of 12 conversations. And they all center about leadership in one way or another. Caroline says, how do we access leadership opportunities available? You know, I think I want to put the question back to our viewers today, our participants. In your opinion, you know, what do you see as a leadership opportunity? Because I think for young leaders as well, we have to be courageous to actually take on the leadership. Sometimes when I speak to young people, I get the sense that they are always sort of getting ready to get ready to get ready, which means, Caroline, that opportunities do actually come, but we simply miss them because we are not having the courage to be able to, you know, move from getting ready. And I think that our goal as senior leaders is to create that launch pad for you to be able to move from that position of getting ready. But what are some of the opportunities? I think that there are so many opportunities in academia. Of course, for us, we are always thinking about research, you know. As a nurse researcher, making sure that I always have a young nurse on the research project, or another clinician on the research project, you know, really important. I think, you know, those are opportunities that are available that often we don't get to see. But I think that usually we identify opportunities for leadership by looking at our communities where we live. The opportunity is not going to exist in Gulu for me because I actually don't live in Gulu. But I need to look at my own community to see, you know, what are the opportunities for service. And those are plenty around us. We only need to look. So even if you are not licensed to work as a nurse within the hospitals, are you able to volunteer? In my early years as a young nurse, you know, aspiring to become a leader, I spent so much time volunteering my time, and some of the lessons that I've learned over time were actually learned during those formidable years that I was able to just get into the opportunity. I remember one year I spent the whole year reading to patients who are bedbound, who were not able to move from, you know, their hospital beds to go outside or, you know, anything like that. So these were really sick patients. Sometimes patients were on the ventilator, but, you know, just hearing somebody's voice. So I actually spent a whole year, you know, every single day going to this hospital in Russellville, Arkansas, and, you know, reading to a patient and asking nurses, do you have a patient, you know, who is unconscious or who would like to be ready to, or just, you know, would like to have the company of somebody in the room. And I was able to do that. But, you know, for me, that was, if I had just spent time getting ready to get ready, I would have missed that opportunity. By planting myself within that context, I got to see leadership in action. I got to see nurses and midwives, you know, engaging in decision making, being really bold and courageous to lobby on behalf of their own patients who didn't have the voice, you know, leading an organization, understanding an organization, understanding their role as a part, as crucial members of the organization. It was an opportunity for me to learn. So I think that a way to answer Caroline's question, you know, how do we access opportunities, is being able to actually see those opportunities and taking advantage of those opportunities, because those opportunities do exist.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rose. We have two questions, one from Tracy and another one from Irene. And then we have a hand up from Leonard. And so the first question is, just a moment. Okay. What should young nurses and midwives do to ensure that we can get into these positions? So we do have nurses interested in getting into these positions, but perhaps at a loss of what to do to get into these positions. So perhaps you can talk about that. The other one is one from Elliot. As a young nurse interested in taking up leadership role in community nursing, what are those missed opportunities or strategies I could utilize to achieve this? So he's really specific on community nursing. Within community nursing, what are those opportunities that are there that he can take part in? Perhaps one of them is the one you just talked about, going into the facility, reading to people who need to be read to, and providing some skill that's free, that's perhaps might be lacking within the facility. And maybe we take one from Irene, and then you answer those, and then we get we listen from Leonard, who has a question as well. Irene says, how do we bridge the gap so that both sides, young and senior, realize they have something to learn from one another?
Thank you very much, Florence. Let me actually start with Irene's question. Thank you, Irene. How do we bridge the gap? I think that bridging the gap is not likely to occur if we focus on the negatives. If we focus on, you know, all those, I don't know if you remember that slide that I put up, where the conversation is about, you know, how this slide, where we are looking at, you know, leadership is broken, is not well coordinated. These are research based results of young nurse and midwife leaders. They perceive leadership as broken, not well coordinated, misdirection of resources, significant gaps between the promise and the performance of senior leaders, how senior leaders abuse the authority and the privileges. You know, there's weak cultures of accountability. So I think that we have a challenge there where the conversation focuses on what is not working, instead of, what are the opportunities and how do we leverage those opportunities. But also I think that the research get to those ideas, because if we simply, can you hear me, Florence?
Yes, I can hear you. Whoever is Techno F1.
Somebody's sharing a screen. Thank you.
Yes.
So Irene, I think it's really important for us to change the conversation, because what is missed in that is that we are not looking at the talent of both groups. We are focusing on the gap. Once we begin to look at, okay, so what do young people have that they can contribute? And also, what do the senior group have that we currently need? And then how do we build synergy for those two? And that's not work that is going to happen in a day, but we definitely need to start having that conversation. So the use of champions for narrative change, for guiding the conversation back to, okay, what is the talent? What can we do collectively? Focusing on not the things that divide us, but the things that actually can bring us back together. I think that is one way for us to bridge that gap, but also understanding and appreciating those differences. What I find surprising often is that, the differences and the strength of the baby boomers, we have no room to understand it, because they are so different from the way, the millennials actually think. But it is actually the same thing that is happening among young people as well. So I think this conversation is about, you cannot bridge a gap if you are constantly looking at what separates us. We can only bridge the gap when we begin to focus on the things that bring us together. And the things that bring us together really, healthcare systems. How do we strengthen healthcare systems? How do we make sure our patients have good, positive outcomes consistently? There are a lot of unifying elements of the work that we collectively do. And to bridge gaps, we need to be able to focus on that work and on that conversation. In terms of community, opportunities within the community, really, I think the first step for me is volunteering, but also taking stock of what opportunities actually exist. It's very difficult for me to know what opportunities exist, as I said, in Gulu, because I don't live in Gulu. But if you live in Gulu and you walk around you, and you count how many hospitals, how many NGOs, what are the demographics, who needs support and who needs help in the community. But the other thing to think about is actually, what is your own talent? What do you want to give back to the community? I usually focus on the things that are within my talent. I run these webinars because I'm passionate about leadership. I wouldn't probably be able to run the webinar about a topic that I do not understand. So understanding our talent and how we can use that as a gift to the community where we live and where we work. So I think that is important in actually identifying opportunities, because you can match the opportunity to your competences, to your skills, to your own passions, and to your own vision, and so on and so forth. And how do we get into positions? How do we get into positions? We need to create those opportunities for you. That was the first question. How do people get into the positions? Of course, it's important that we ourselves are growing. I lead a leadership series for executive nurses and midwives. And one of the first elements of our conversation is leading self. Because if you are not able to lead self, you know, you can forget about getting into a position. Of course, you can get into a position and have all the power, but without the influence, without the ability to move and change and shake things, without the ability to lead effectively, you could be in that position in a title only. So we need to have leaders who are not there in title only. We need leaders who have the competences. So it's important for young leaders to actually get into that journey for developing yourself as a leader, understanding yourself as a leader, developing self-leadership. It has to start with you first before you can get into the leadership positions. Majority of the leadership positions that I have gotten into, it's been because I have been working really hard on myself and somebody else notices. Somebody else notices and they are able to invite me to the table. And then I run with it. So I think, you know, it has to be a balanced approach that you as a young leader, as I said, you have talent. There's no doubt about it, but you also need to grow and you need to invest in growing as a young leader. So starting with yourself, I think, is a good way to be able to get into those positions. For the current tenants of leaders, as I mentioned, our job is to create doors for you to get into those leadership positions, okay? Creating succession planning and not getting to the lifeboat all by ourselves. So there has to be a balance between those two groups working together.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Perhaps we could hear from Leonard. You had your hand up, and then I'll read the other questions. Leonard?
Thank you very much, Dr. Rose, for the presentation. Actually, I wanted to say there exists now a leadership gap between the nurses within the public government setting and those in private. And when we look at the people who would be our leaders, possibly within the nursing council, I don't think what you are doing is what they must have already started on doing to ensure that they develop the leadership of the nurses that are within their council. But however, according to me, I think they have not yet done a lot. And also when it comes to bringing others to table, as you stated in your discussion, I think that since many nurses have diversified in their field, many of them have pursued other courses. It is now about positioning themselves. Nurses have to get a way of how they can begin positioning themselves, because you never know. It is only when you look at the field of practice within the government facilities, hospitals, down to the health facility, majority of the nurses who are in practice are those possibly at the diploma level. Many of the nurses who would be great leaders with bachelor's, masters in nursing are not in the actual practice and even in the administration of the hospital. Even if you went to our national referral hospital, Morago, you may not find a nurse maybe within the management, apart from maybe the head of the nursing in the facility. But many of the bachelor nurses are nowhere within the practice, and they would provide very good leadership to the rest of the nurses. So I don't know how the government can also, and even the nursing council that registers these nurses, can think of bringing these nurses with bachelor's nurses to the table and they begin providing leadership to the rest of the nurses. Otherwise, thank you very much, Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Leonard. Good to hear from you. I hope you are well and safe. Let me talk to you a little bit about the positive things that are actually happening in the ecosystem, sadly, as a result of COVID-19. In April of last year, we convened a nurses and midwives leaders think tank, which drew leaders from both the public and the private sector. And it's probably one of the first entities that I'm a part of where I have seen that it is possible to bridge these gaps in terms of bringing the private and the public sector nurses and midwives together for a cause. I do believe that, you know, maybe that's the start of something new, but also something really powerful if we can continue to create spaces and groups that are integrated among both those groups, the private and public sector. The other issue really is, and I'm sure that the Nursing and Midwives Council is working very hard on this, reevaluating the regulatory framework to be one that is more inclusive and expands beyond the public sector. And looks at, because there are just so many nurses that work in the private sector that are usually left out, as you mentioned. But I think that there are efforts going on with the Nursing and Nursing Council to be able to, again, you know, look at that divide and look at ways in which the regulatory framework can bring those two groups together and build synergy. I know that they are looking at a long-term strategic plan, and they are already inviting private leaders to be at the table in that conversation. So while there are a lot of things that have not happened well in the past, I hope that going forward, we can all be responsible and we can be champions for the things that we would like to see in the future. One of which is narrowing that divide between the public and private practitioners and making sure that people have access both to learning, to continuing professional development, and that the investment is shared equally to allow capacity building across the healthcare system, not just within the public or just within the private healthcare system. Secondly, I think that we need more nurses with bachelor's degrees and we need more nurses with master's degrees, and definitely need more nurses with PhD. And it requires investment. And I've talked about this, in fact, in my last webinar with Last Mile Health, that we need to invest. Majority of nurses at the diploma level and at the enrolled nursing level, and sometimes even at the bachelor's degree level, are not earning the amount of money that can actually support continuing education in those pipelines. I do not even know of a single organization in Uganda that funds, for example, PhD studies for nurses in this country. Maybe other people do know, but I'm not aware of an existence of such an organization. We have fewer organizations in this country that primarily focus on sponsoring advanced nursing education at both the bachelor's degree level and at the master's degree level. And so when I talk about creating opportunities, those are all areas of investment where we need to increase opportunities for bachelor's degree preparation and for master's degree preparation for the largest number of nurses and midwives in this country sit at that level of enrollment and diploma as diploma holders. So that's another pipeline where we have to be more intentional. You know, I need somebody who takes over my job to be equally qualified, you know, with a PhD, if not better. So, you know, for somebody to move into my position as a nurse leader, as a vice chancellor of an academic institution, they need to have that level of preparedness, and it costs so much money. So I don't know who the champions are on this call, but we need to be able to do that. And this means that the government needs to be a champion for ring fencing funds that can support nursing education and development, midwifery education and development, and so on, in service training, post-service training, etc., across the healthcare system, not just within the private sector, but within the private sector as well, but also private entities and organizations, NGOs, to be able to allocate funding to support this level of robust development within the nursing profession. That is the only way we can reposition nursing and midwifery in the country, and ultimately that's the only way we can position them to lead within the policy circles, from the bedside to the policy circles. Next question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rose. I am moving on to Facebook first. We have something from Helen Lay. I came across this accidentally while working on development plans for the team I managed. The slide on characteristics of different ages was so helpful in reminding me that I'm old and most of them are young. Lovely to hear. The other ones are, Samuel says this is a nice lecture, he's enjoying it. So the rest of them are saying they are enjoying the lecture and thank you. And then back to Zoom, we have a question from Caroline who says, how do we bridge the gap of inferiority by maybe cold experienced nurses by years they have worked, and more assertive and young nurses aspiring to be leaders? Bridging the gap, I think, still there. And we have something else from Sarafina who says this was really needed at this time. Martin says some leaders are unapproachable and never appreciative. How can this be overcome in nursing practice? Let's see if we have just one more question. Okay, I think we have those so far. Let's do those two. Still bridging the gap, it's really key.
Thank you. I think that this webinar and this conversation is timely, partly because of my own experience of that divide, that it does exist. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that it does exist, but to not end the conversation there at acknowledging that, you know, a gap exists, or some leaders are unapproachable, and so on. I think that's why when I was putting these slides together, I talked both about the current tenets of leadership, the current cultures we have established, the traditions and the norms of leadership we have established, and the importance of opening doors. So that I hope that we are able to listen we ourselves as senior leaders, that we are able to listen, that how crucially important it is to, like Helen says, acknowledge that we are old and that somebody needs to take our job, and that we are not doing a very good job of actually allowing them in, letting them in, and preparing them and creating opportunities for them to watch us in action. So that in terms of bridging the gap, the conversation needs to be happening on both sides, and having the courage to challenge. However, I was recently engaging in a discussion about negotiation, and we were looking at how nurses are usually not very good negotiators, because we do not often lead with, you know, the talent and with the trade-offs. You know, we often come to the table expecting, and I want you to hear me when I say this, expecting that people should know that the work we do is important. And because the work we do is important, they should automatically invest their resources in us. And sometimes, I think we think that the leaders we work with, they should automatically see that we are working really hard, and they should then recognize us and so on. And yes, I understand that leaders are responsible for recognizing talent, for harnessing that talent, for fanning the flame, and for creating opportunities for young people. But young people really need to, and I think Safina mentioned this, they needed to be able to tap into their own self-esteem. You know, if I bring a meal in front of you, you need to be able to feed yourself, essentially. And so there is a responsibility. If you want to grow, there is a responsibility for you to take and learn, you know, and learn the ropes, and use your talent for negotiation. And I think that maybe needs to be our next discussion. How do we negotiate? Because when we negotiate, we often are misunderstood. When we negotiate, you know, for positions of leadership, when we negotiate for promotions, we often are misunderstood, and people often tend to think that you are being greedy, for example, when you are negotiating for either acknowledgement or recognition for your own contribution, recognition of your own talent, recognition of what you bring to the table. So you need to be able to use that as your leverage. You know, what is it that you are bringing to the table? In my commissioning, when I commission the students on graduation day, I always remind them of one thing, that employers are looking for a solution. When they advertise in the newspaper and they advertise a position, you know, they are looking for a solution to a specific problem that they have. And for you as a graduate, you are the solution that they are looking for. But you have to be able to position yourself as the solution that they are looking for. And we go to great length of, you know, creating our CVs to sort of match the problem that has been advertised. We are positioning ourselves as solutions to the problems that exist. One of the things that I want to encourage young leaders to do is please remember that, you know, you have talent, but you need to be able to position that talent, you know, within the organization where you work as a solution for the problems that they have. And maybe we need to explore more with specific examples of how that can happen, okay? But what I'm hearing often is, I have talent and nobody's recognizing it. And maybe that is the current state of affairs. But it is possible for us to change that, which is why we are having this conversation. You know, this is not about just the young leaders, it's about the senior leaders as well, to be able to hear what I am talking about, to be able to hear what you are saying. You are saying you have talent, but they are not recognizing it. You have talent, but the opportunities are not there. So let's continue in that conversation.
Thank you. We have a comment from Sarafina. I think that you have delved into a bit. Nurses and midwives have a great judgment when it comes to patient treatment and decision-making in the health sector, but unfortunately, did I lose that? But unfortunately, they are not given an opportunity in the workplace to practice out their judgment. How can we get policies to give them room to practice freely and speak out their mind? So it does look like while the opportunity is there, we need to give them the platform. I know you talked about media that they can use, lobbying, but are there pointers? As you discussed, these are young nurses, and they've probably not experienced or not worked in this sector of speaking out for themselves. So how do they speak out for themselves? How do they stand in the gap? How do they step in to be recognized, to be heard, but also to be given the opportunity to make change?
There are opportunities. I don't know if Tracy, my colleague Tracy, is online, or Irene at Hyre. There are some opportunities that we are beginning to create for young nurses and midwives. And one of them is actually enhancing their ability to write and publish their own stories. Because I think that, you know, talent hidden is not useful for anyone at all. One of the things that we have done in the past year is to create this nursing and midwives letter, where we are highlighting, you know, talents of young nurses, and we publish this on a monthly basis. So I think that, you know, please do join our workshops. Part of this conversation in leadership is to increase the skill set of young nurses and midwives to be able to write, harness voice, tell their own stories, talk about the experiences of patient care that they have, talk about how they are using their talent to improve and impact patient outcomes. These are all stories that we don't hear very often. So we are creating spaces for that voice. We are creating opportunities for them to be able to send their stories to us, to learn how to write. So I think that that is a specific, you know, example of how we can enhance that, and also, you know, nurture that so that people have a confidence to be able to do that. I don't know if Tracy is online. She can talk a little bit about those writing opportunities. I'm not saying this because I'm in education, but I do believe that, you know, one way for us to change the tide about nursing and midwifery is for us to take responsibility for our own story and to be able to tell it to the world. Instead of us constantly saying, but the world doesn't understand what we do, and the world is not recognizing what we do, and the world is not rewarding what we do, can we take responsibility for our own story and put that story out? But we need to have the skills to do so. We need data to lobby. And if we are not providing that data, we are not able to lobby effectively because we don't have the trade-offs, you know, to create leverage to secure, you know, more of the resources that we are looking for. So Tracy, are you online? Do you want to talk about opportunities available in writing and how that really is building capacity for nurses who aspire to become leaders?
Yes, Dr. Rose, thank you so much. I'm not able to join video, but I'll just talk a little bit about that. So you did a nice intro about the Nurses and Midwives letter, which we release every month. Dr. Rose is actually the chief editor, and myself and other two colleagues, Elizabeth, Irene, are both online, are also contributors, are also editors, co-editors. But the contributions in terms of articles and the content that goes into the newsletter are mixed from the senior leadership in the country, but more importantly, the articles and stories from around the country, from regional referral hospitals, from nurses who are still in school, from nurses who are doing internship, and they write about their experiences, they write about what needs to change in the nursing profession, they make recommendations, and these are read by the senior leadership for organizations such as the council, which has been talked about in this webinar. So with that, we are creating a platform that has not been available to nurses for a very long time for them to air out grievances, share their ideas for development of the profession, and also bridging that communication gap between the senior leadership and the young nurses, which has been big for the last couple of years. So if you're listening and you're a young nurse leader, my colleagues, either Elizabeth or Irene, will type in an email address in the chat where you can send your write-up, your article. It can also be creative writing, or it can be scientific writing, whichever is easier for you. And we have, as I mentioned, co-editors that can work with you if you're not confident, and we can help you build your writing skills. Yeah. Dr. Ross, over to you. I hope that was sufficient.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's just being able to publish those opportunities, because the questions seem to be the same. How do we bridge the gap? You know, how do we enter into those opportunities? Senior leaders not recognizing our contributions, even when we have the experience. I think that was one of the questions. You know, the nurse has the experience, they have the talent, they have all these years under their belt, and they are passed over for promotion, and their remuneration probably doesn't equal the level of talent that they have generated over the years. So those are all problems that we know exist. We are beginning to write about those problems. We are growing the circulation list for the newsletter, so that this newsletter gets in front of the people who are important decision makers, who make decisions that impact nursing and midwifery in general, but also ultimately impact nurse and midwifery leaders who are emerging within the profession. So, you know, we do acknowledge that these challenges exist, but again, you know, replication, let us replicate leaders who open doors for you. Let us replicate leaders who recognize that experience and are able to acknowledge it and celebrate it. And more importantly, send us your story so that we are able to write about it and tell other nurses about it. Let me share a final slide, Florence, that I had in this. because it's something that I keep thinking about. This was my final slide, which talks about, you know, let us bring other people to the table. As I mentioned, you know, you cannot have a track record without being on the track. And it's important for us to, you know, push you on the track and then, you know, cheer you on and be your cheerleaders as you grow, as you learn to become efficient and responsible nurse and midwife leaders. But I love this quote from Whitley and Colonel Rogers, which says, who we become together will always be different than who we are alone. And our range of creative expression increases when we join others. So really this divide that exists between the generations, we are missing an opportunity there. That's another missed opportunity, because our range of creative expression and energy will only increase when we bring those two groups together, when we join together. And new relationships create capacities. So mentoring and sandwiching young and older leaders, you know, that level of relationship creation among leaders can only result in enhanced capacity for nursing leadership for the profession. So, you know, hopefully senior nursing leaders on the call today are able to hear that we need to sandwich ourselves, you know, with young nurse and midwife leaders to, you know, create synergy and to create new capacity to achieve. So I hope that this has been really helpful. I don't know if there are additional comments or questions, Florence, but we are at that 4:30 time. I would like to hand back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose. Just two very different comments. One person says the challenge is some of the current leaders look at the young nurses who is really optimistic and have the enthusiasm to learn and see them as being a threat to their positions, hence trying to do away with the young leaders. The other comment is from Sarafina, who says nurses and midwives are the backbone of medical practice. We need to appreciate that generally. So for me, this is really good, but I see two distinct attitudes. One is someone who is willing to fight. One is sort of tending towards being a pity party. So my message to the nursing leadership and the young nurses is that you need to be unapologetically aggressive about getting your voice heard, because it's been years, you've been here for a very, very long time and it hasn't happened. So unless the nurses come up, step up, get those articles heard, share them everywhere you can and speak for yourselves, no one is going to speak for you. So leaning towards how do we work together as nurses? How do we work as a collective and get our voices heard and get onto policies and get onto those tables that make decisions? We just need to come together and stop feeling like we've been ignored, but move towards, you will recognize that I'm here, whether you like it or not. And that's how we shall get our voices heard. And so thank you so much, Dr. Rose. Thank you so much for everyone that's been here. We are 3 minutes over our time, and I hope that when we'll have another conversation next month, and we'll invite you. Hopefully you'll be able to attend, and we'll try to mix up the time so that some of them are on different days of the week so that different audiences can be able to join us. So thank you very much, and I hope that we've learned something, and I hope that we shall continue having these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence, and everybody who is here. See you next month. Join our next conversation. Invite other people in the conversation. Thank you, Florence, for hosting us.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good evening. Thank you too.
Thank you so much for inviting us for this meeting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We've been blessed.
Okay, thanks so much. It was good.